So, welcome to the second of our simulation guided trial design talks. This one's going to be on phase 1 dose escalation designs. And one of the kind of themes of the webinar series is kind of justifying or making the case for using simulation as when you design your trials. And in this setting, the case is very simple. I'm sure everyone doing phase 1 dose escalation studies, unless they're doing 3+3, will be using simulation, in order to, at least to some degree, in order to understand their design. So, in that sense, my job here is easier than will be in some of the latest talks in terms of justifying simulation. But in other ways, it's more complicated, as we'll see. What we can do with simulation for this kind of trial is I think, richer and more necessary, but more complicated and perhaps a little trickier than other types of trial design. So let's have a look at what we're talking about today. So what we're going to do is pick a simple use case, a simple example. I'm going to look at a phase 1 study where the remit is to study 6 doses from 25 milligrams up to 800 milligrams. And quite possibly how this came about was initially the team said, well, there's 4 doses we want to study, 50, 100, 200, and 400. But we've maybe gone back to them and said, or you've gone back to them and said, well, I really need a low dose, a very low dose, which is you're almost going to guarantee me is safe and below the target toxicity, so that I can drop back to it if we are unfortunate in seeing toxicity at the first dose. And then if we ask the question at some point, well, what would you do if you got to the 400 milligram dose and we didn't see any toxicity? And certainly we've heard this in conversations with clinical teams before. They go, we go one higher, we go to 800. So it's quite possible that there is a higher dose than is available, than is initially written into the protocol. For this example, I'm going to take a slightly lower target toxicity rate than usual. This was partly because I had a lot of examples of books targeting kind of a standard 30% toxicity rate, which is kind of a hangover of the 3+3. I believe it's actually more common these days to look at lower toxicity rates. And so I thought this would make it interesting both for me and you. And let's say that I'm going to bracket that target toxicity range of 0.2 by saying I'm kind of happy with any dose that's got a toxicity rate between 0.15 and 0.3. And we'll have a very traditional sort of trial design. We'll use cohorts of 3, and we'll stop when we get to say 12 patients, 4 cohorts on the chosen dose. Perhaps a little more than usual, but that's because we're targeting a slightly lower toxicity rate. And actually to observe that kind of rate, we do need to test more people at that dose. And initially what I'm going to do is compare 3 very current types of design, the I3+3, the MTPI2, and the BOIN designs, which are all fairly similar methods. They take the target toxicity rate and the target toxicity band, and they turn those each one through a slightly different method into a set of dose escalation, into a decision table as to whether to escalate or stay at the same dose, depending on how many subjects have been tested and how many toxicities have been observed on that dose. And then later on, we'll compare this to doing a CRM design using Bayesian logistic regression, where there's a few more parameters to play with, and there's perhaps more to explore with the simulation. And that's almost all we need to start doing this kind of design. Except what is crucial is to have a set of plausible scenarios that the team thinks, maybe this is our least toxicity estimate and our highest toxicity estimate and a middling toxicity estimate, and then maybe some in between, and maybe some with lower, shallower curves and some with steeper curves. So you'll need, that's a crucial part of doing this kind of design is getting those scenarios, because as you'll see with the simulation driven design here, it's looking at the operating characteristics of the design in these scenarios that's going to drive all our decision making and our evaluation of the designs. And so what we're coming up with is a design in some sense optimized, or at least tuned, to try to address this range of scenarios. So getting this range of scenarios is out of a clinical team is pretty critical to designing this kind of trial. It doesn't matter how you do it. So here are my simple set of scenarios. So in each one, I've picked a different dose to be the maximum tolerated dose. So the first one, it's at 50 milligrams, second at 100, then 200, 400, and 800. And I've adjusted the toxicities around those doses accordingly to give me nice monotonic scenarios. Now, this is probably not a very good set. For a start, they all include a dose which has exactly the target toxicity, which is probably a little bit unrealistic. They all have really rather similar gradients. They tend to go from 0.1 to 0.2 to 0.4 or 0.5. And in practice, you'll need a wider range. But this is enough for my purposes today. So the three types of design, the BOIN, the I3+3, and the MTPI2, all require extremely similar inputs. So basically, if I create one, in fact, it's very easy for me to convert it to one of the other two. So I'll start with a BOIN, and then we'll switch to, and then we'll also create an I+3+3 and an MTPI2. And basically, I'm going to input these things I've just outlined, that there'll be 6 doses. I've input the 5 scenarios. I'll say that the maximum number of cohorts in total available is 12, with 3 patients per cohort. These all have a rule I haven't mentioned. They have a rule that allows you to specify a max allowable probability that the dose exceeds the target. This actually, in practice, you have to set pretty high in order for these designs to be able to escalate. So the default is 0.95. If you start setting it much lower than that, you'll find the designs will either be slow to escalate because they'll want to see more patients without toxicity at lower doses, or they'll even be picking doses that are too low because they'll never get to the target dose. And we'll have a stopping rule that will stop once the next dose we want to treat already has 12 patients on it. So we've met our 12 patients on the target dose rule. Otherwise, I'll use the target, the BOIN default bounds and a target toxicity of 0.2. So we'll put that in. And we'll start with a dose escalation rule-based design. And a new one. I'll use a template. And we'll start by specifying the number of doses, which is 6. Let's just take the moment to put in the right names. This is obviously helpful when presenting. Oops, this one's 25. This is helpful when presenting to a team, rather than they have to sort of constantly translate from dose 3 to, which dose strength is that? And then we put in our dose responses. Now I've already created this in another one, so I'll just show you just entering a single one, just so it's clear how they're entered. So let's just do the first one where the response is at 50 milligrams, or the target response. So I said the toxicity rate on the 25 milligram dose is going to be 0.1, and the 50 is going to rise steeply to the 50 milligram dose, which is where which is the target, and then of course it's going to rise pretty rapidly from there on. And then we're closing a rate of 1, so it's going to plateau out like that. So then this is the design tab for these kind of designs. So I pick BOIN. I say maximum number of cohorts is 12. The cohort size is 3. We take the default maximum probability that the dose exceeds the target toxicity, 0.95. I'm going to stop if there's 12 subjects on a dose. I'll use the default BOIN bounds given my target toxicity rate, which is 0.2. So that's calculated. Now BOIN creates two sets of boundaries. One is the first is the set of boundaries, which is a sort of a default of points. The lower bound is 0.6 of the target, and the upper bound is 1.4 of the target. And then from those, it derives actual escalation and de-escalation bounds, which you see here, with the resulting decision table here. So here we can look at, say, for a cohort of 3, if there's no toxicities, it'll escalate. If there's 1 toxicity, it'll de-escalate. If there's 2 or 3 toxicities, it will de-escalate and will have exceeded the 0.95 rule, so it won't come back to this dose. So it will prevent re-escalation back up to the whatever dose that was. Obviously, we've got columns here for 1, 2, 4, 5 patients, which won't arise because we're doing cohorts of 3. So the next column of interest is 6. And there you can see if we only had 1 toxicity, we'll stay. If we have 2 toxicities, we'll de-escalate, and so on. And at this point, we can simply run some simulations. And there that's showing the MTD selection, which is looking pretty good, over 80% on the 50 milligram dose. And we can look at some allocation and toxicity histories to see how the design actually performs in practice. So for instance, here's an interesting one. We've had no toxicity on the first 2 doses. Then we see 1 toxicity, so it de-escalates. We see no toxicities, so it re-escalates. We see 2 more toxicities, so now it'll de-escalate and almost certainly refuse to re-escalate. And then it completes by testing the 50 milligram dose, where we see 1 toxicity, and that's the dose it ends up selecting. So we'll just look at the broader, we'll do the cooking show of here's what I did earlier. So here's the one where I'd entered full range of scenarios. So now I have 5 rows of simulation results, 1 for each of those scenarios. I've done 1,000 simulations of each one. And we can start to look at the broader operating characteristics as well. So first of all, we can look at the cross scenario graphs, and we can see how often a particular dose was selected as MTD and whether that dose being selected had a toxicity rate that was in the target band, was below that, had a toxicity that was below the target or in excess of the target. So you can see, actually, once we do more simulations, the proportion of times it's getting the MTD right in the 50 milligram cases come down a little bit. And for the further scenarios, it's getting picking the MTD only about 50% of the time, a little bit more when it's the top dose. But it's got quite a good safety profile. It's not tending to pick a dose above the target very often. If it's going to miss, it's much more inclined to miss on the low side. Now we can take my demo. Okay, so we can change this with an 3+3 design very easily. We simply go into the design tab. We've got everything else set up as before. We pick out +3+3. We'll save it as a 3+3 demo. It's written in the default BOIN boundaries, which are not the ones that we as the team had agreed to use. So I'll try and change those. And I still have a maximum of 12 cohorts, a cohort size of 3. Stop when the next dose has 12 subjects on it. And this do not revisit rule of 0.95 if the maximum probability that the dose exceeds target. You can see we've got a slightly different decision table here. We'll see that in the... We can see that here. That lays out the BOIN table versus the I3+3 table. So these two very similar methods will end up with slightly different behaviors. So having entered those, we go back to our simulations tab. We can run 1,000 simulations of each quite quickly. And there we got our simulation results. So it's a similar sort of shape to the BOIN, but some of these numbers here in the middle are a little bit better in terms of picking the MTD. So on the slide, having gone from just the BOIN, I stack them up. And now, this is comparing it to MTP-I2, which is extremely similar, and to the I3+3, where it's just a little bit better. You can see here in the top scenario, it's 0.6 success of correct selection rather than about 0.55. And the heights of these are just a little bit better too. And it's a bit more obvious. It's a bit more obvious if I tabulate them. So here's for each scenario, the proportion of time the MTD is selected. You can see a 50 milligram scenario, it's about the same. We've got about 4% improvement in the 100 milligram, pretty much the same in the 200, about 4% improvement again in the 400, and about 4% again in the 800. It's not a big difference, but it's all on the right side. Also, the mean number of subjects tends to be a little bit lower with the I3+3. Every now and again, the BOIN is using one more cohort. So in about 30 to 50% of the time, it's using an additional cohort to complete. And there's not a lot of difference in the amount of toxicity that's being seen. So one question we can ask is how do these, what's actually going on in practice during the trial to lead to those differences? So, for instance, here's the target, the true target is at the 200 milligram dose. So here's a scenario from the this will be the BOIN on the left and the I3+3 on the right. And you can see up until about the 6th cohort, the behavior is the same. So they both see a toxicity in the first cohort. They both require 9 subjects, 3 full cohorts with no more toxicity before they'll escalate. They escalate to the 50 milligram dose where they see no toxicity, so they're happy to escalate again. And then at the 100 milligram, they both see a toxicity. And the BOIN de-escalates at that point, and the I3+3 doesn't. And the I3+3 tests a second cohort, which has another toxicity, which does cause a de-escalation. But we then get a cohort with no toxicities. So we have 6 without toxicity. So it re-escalates to 100 milligrams and then sees no more toxicity. And we get to our 12 subjects with only 2 toxicities, and the 100 milligram is selected. The BOIN. So obviously the data it starts to see diverges as it starts to pick different doses to escalate to. So it goes down and it sees another toxicity at the 50 milligrams. So it takes another cohort before it escalates. And when it goes back up to 100 milligrams, we get 2 toxicities, 2 cohorts without toxicity. So it escalates again, sees 1 toxicity at 200 milligrams and de-escalates when we see 1 more toxicity at 100 milligrams, and it too completes because it's now happy to stay at that dose with 2 toxicities out of 12. So it gets to the same place, but it's taken 2 more cohorts than the I3+3. So let's just take a look at this process of sort of comparing histories. So we'll line the I3+3 up here. And have I got the BOIN open? No, let's reopen the BOIN. So again, we'll pick this middle scenario as being hopefully interesting, and for both of them, we're going to use the allocation and toxicity history, which will show us individual simulations. And this is pretty crucial when you're doing this kind of design, is to be able to go down to this level of simulation. And it's important for 2 purposes. The first, and possibly the most important, is communicating to the team how the design might behave in practice. Now, of course, you can show them the decision tables, but that's even though those are pretty specific, they're still a bit abstract, and it's doesn't immediately allow you to visualize how a trial might proceed. But on the other hand, that's what these graphs allow you to do exactly. Now, of course, each one of these will be a different history, and what is shown is going to depend exactly on when and how many toxicities were simulated. So we have to look at quite a few of them before anyone could be sort of comfortable with this kind of design. But so here again, you can see the BOIN just has this bouncing around a little bit more. It's less. There are less stay decisions in its table, so it's more likely to escalate and de-escalate, and that it causes it to this tendency to possibly take an additional cohort. We can step through. So this is what happens when we don't see toxicity until at the very top dose. And here you might actually prefer what the BOIN has done, but that's because we can see let's say what the truth is that's being simulated. We've gone above the target, and the I+3+3 has stayed, and then seen 3 toxicities on the next cohort before dropping. In this instance, in both cases, they don't see the full true toxicity of the 400 milligram dose, and both designs select it. And we can just step through until we see histories that sort of strike us as maybe interesting for one reason or another. This is kind of very similar to the one I showed in the slides. And what you'll notice is that because we've used the same random number seed, FACS has followed the same, for the same simulation, has followed the same pattern of simulated data until, of course, the design has taken a different path, and then things diverge. But it does mean it makes it easier to find similar simulations for comparison. So here, the decision bars are identical. So what I hope this is showing is just how powerful for understanding the design and communicating in detail and communicating the design, the ability to visualize individual simulations is. And of course, we want to do it across a range of scenarios. And I think, as Scott said in last week's webinar, you do this until they're almost crying out for just average operating characteristics. They've seen enough. You might show them tens of these individual simulations for it to sink in. Another thing we can do, it's probably a little less interesting in these rule-based ones, but in fact, we can also click on what we call the analysis tab and actually enter data interactively and see what the design does. So I'll save showing that until the NCRM, because it's perhaps a little more interesting in the NCRM. In these, of course, all it's going to do is follow the decision table we've already seen. So you could actually do a pencil and paper trial, or a mock trial with a team, just using the decision table. You wouldn't need the software. So we'll just extend this example now to the CRM. So we're going to keep the same design. Well, we're up to 12 cohorts of 3 subjects, a target toxicity band of between 0.15 and 0.3. When targeting a toxicity band in the CRM, you don't actually specify an individual target toxicity, just the bounds. We'll enter the same scenarios to simulate. The CRM has a thing called overdose control, which allows us to give it a rule that says, while a dose has a posterior probability of toxicity above some limit, then rule it out for allocation. So, for instance, we're going to say if the probability that its toxicity rate is above 0.3, above the top of the band, if that was above 50%, we're not going to allocate to it. So we'll only allocate to doses where that probability is less than 50%. And we can also specify an additional higher band. We can split the above target band into 2, the excess and the unacceptable zones, as Neuenschwander called them. And we can say say that band boundary is at 0.6, and we can say for instance, any dose with a posterior probability that its toxicity is above 0.6. If that's above 15%, then we'll disallow it. We'll enter the same doses, and we'll actually give them their dose strengths: 25, 50, 100, 200, 400, and 800. And then one of the things the Bayesian logistic regression requires is that we tell it how to map those dose strengths onto actual dose strength value that's being fitted in the Bayesian logistic regression equation. And these transformed doses are, for historical reasons, known as the X-hat values, dating all the way back to the original CRM paper. That was the symbol that was used, X, little X with a hat over it. And we'll use Neuenschwander's transformation of taking the log of the dose strength, 25, 50, 100, over some reference dose strength. And in this case, we're going to set the reference dose at 800 at the top of the dose range. So the intercept of our Bayesian logistic regression is linear in the logit space. we're going to set that intercept at the dose strength of 800. And at that dose strength, the slope parameter isn't going to matter, and only the intercept, the alpha parameter, will matter. And then what we're going to do is derive the prior from the scenarios. This is my preferred way of starting out with the prior. I won't end with it, as we'll see quite quickly. But what that does is it very simply fits the Bayesian logistic regression model to each one of the scenarios. So for each one, it derives an alpha and a beta, ending up with, in this case, 5 pairs of alpha and beta. And from that, it simply calculates the bivariate normal distribution and the correlation that corresponds to those 5 pairs of values. And then we can click the accept prior, and those numbers get copied down into the main body of facts, get put in these positions up here. And then over here, to help us understand our prior, what we do is we sample from the prior distribution 100 times. We get 100 pairs of alpha and beta, and we plot each corresponding line. So here's 100 samples from the prior, and it plots the median value and the 5th and the 95th percentile values. And we can see that actually this prior doesn't look uninformative enough. There's too little probability of toxicity at 50 and 100 milligrams. The lines have all got a very similar slope. They're all a little bit too smooth. And this is actually a very common result after deriving a prior in this way. And what we can see is that the mean of alpha is reasonable. In fact, even the spread of the value for alpha looks reasonable. The mean of the slope looks reasonable, but it's not variable enough. So what we're going to do is increase the standard deviation of beta. And the other thing that looks a bit scary is this extremely high value for rho, which is saying that our value for the value of alpha and the value of log beta are really highly correlated. So we're going to decrease the value for rho, and we're going to increase the standard deviation. And typically, what I do is for beta is to double it, the standard deviation, and for rho, here I'm just going to reduce it to a half rather than have it at nearly 1. And the results, so I just slightly less than doubled the standard deviation of the slope, and you can see we now have a lot more variety in the sampling from the prior. We can see that almost all the curves we've got from our scenarios would lie in that sample group. So rather than being either outside it or at the extreme end of it, so I'm relatively happy with that prior now. Is that this will give me a model that ought to fit the data we're going to simulate in the scenarios. So just show you entering all this in facts. Well, I'm going to enter all the. Again, I'll avoid it. Save you watching, entering all the VSRs. So I'll close this one, and we'll start a new dose escalation. In this case, it's a CRM. So we're not looking at efficacy in this design. We're recruiting in cohorts. The maximum number of cohorts is 12. The cohort size is 3. We're not going to do anything else fancy here, groups and expansion cohorts or backfill. The toxicity, we're going to target the toxicity interval. And as we said, the range is going to be from 0.15 to 3. I'm going to limit the max excess and unacceptable toxicity to less than 50%, and the unacceptable toxicity to less than 15%. We have 6 doses. And their strengths were 25, 50, 100, 200, 400, and 800. We enter the dose, the scenarios in the same way. So again, I'll enter the 50 milligram one. It's a nice simple one. In the CRM, we also add these into the rules base, but we also have a way of specifying the scenarios through a parametric model rather than just manually entering the toxicities. And then on the design, so we said we're going to use the log dose transformation, but the reference dose is going to be at the top of the range. So just a note on that choice. When Orange Vander first came up with this method, his recommendation was to take a value in the middle of the dose range, perhaps not even an actual dose, but in between, say maybe 150, and that gives the model more flexibility to fit. But we've seen in some cases, particularly if the prior on the slope is a little tight, that it can have some odd effects, that the model can sort of seesaw around the reference point, with the odd result that if it sees less toxicity below on the doses below the reference point, it's actually predicting more toxicity above the reference point, and vice versa, which is a little bit counterintuitive and maybe not where you'd want it to behave. So our preference is to move the reference to one end or other of the dose range. Practice is often works out pretty similarly, whichever you choose. My thinking here is that at the bottom of the dose range, we're pretty much always going to have almost no toxicity at dose 1 of the 25 milligram. So the value of alpha is varying between values that correspond to like 0.01 toxicity and 0.0001 toxicity, which isn't really a very meaningful thing. It's just varying one end of the line while it tries to fit the slope. So I thought it's perhaps more interesting to let it fit at the upper end. So hence that. And then we use the derive. I like to use the derived prior option. There are a number of options here. I like to use the scenarios one. I can't at the moment because there aren't enough. I haven't entered enough scenarios to do that. So let's just quickly show you a different way of doing it, but it's going to come up with slightly different results. We can specify that the probability of unacceptable toxicity at the lowest doses is pretty low, say 0.05, whereas the probability of being below the toxicity band on the highest dose is also pretty low. So we'll say 0.2, and we can also give the probability that toxicity is below the middle of my band at the medium dose, or we'll say that's 50%, have it in the middle. And we can derive a prior. We could accept it, and that's giving us a prior with perhaps a lot more variability at the lower dose than I really need. We then have the allocation rules. Here it's very simple. We don't use a run-in. We simply escalate using the dose levels. We just need one cohort on a dose before it's complete. And when it is, we just increment by one dose level. So the escalation is just the same as in the rules-based. And the stopping criteria, we simply require there to be 4 cohorts on the cohorts required to be MTD. So we'll just put in a matching stopping rule to the other methods. Now, these do take a little longer to simulate than the rules-based ones because it's actually fitting the Bayesian logistic model every cohort. But it's still not too long. And you can see again the 50, like with the rules-based, finding the MTD on this scenario where the true answer is dose 2 is pretty easy, and we successfully do it over 80% of the time. Now let's have the. So here's one I did earlier where I've got the full range of scenarios in. We've got the adjusted prior derived from the scenarios, and I've run 1,000 simulations of each, and we've got the results. There you can see the first thing that strikes us is our green peaks are quite a bit higher than with the rules-based, so we're doing better at finding the MTD, but we've got a little bit more yellow than with the rules-based too. So if it's getting it wrong, it's having a tendency to overshoot. So here, for instance, is a comparison of the I3 plus 3 against the CRM, and you can see we're higher in the CRM there, we're higher here, where it's below. These two, it's above 60%, whereas with the I3 plus 3, it's around 55%. 400 milligram, it's similar. 800 milligram, actually, the CRM is doing a little bit worse. You can see, again, using the target at 200, I was able to find some scenarios that actually played out almost identically. The I3 plus 3 sees an extra toxicity, but the result is the same. But they can go quite differently. So here they start out the same, but you can see the CRM escalates quicker. It doesn't require 9 on the dose, on the lowest dose before it escalates. And on seeing 2 out of 6, it stays at the same dose, whereas the I3 plus 3 drops before re-escalating. So this, and then here's another where it's again performed differently. The CRM was, so they both see no toxicity until the 3rd dose. CRM again escalates after 6 rather than 9, and then nearly completes, except there's 2 toxicities on the last cohort on the 200 milligram dose. It drops down. It sees no more toxicities on the 100 milligram dose, re-escalates, and then is happy with this dose. If you like, it's used the information of this lack of toxicity below it, plus the fact that it's re-escalated to a dose where it's already seen 12 subjects before picking it. The I3 plus 3 in this case, actually, it just had 1 less simulated toxicity, so it was prepared to pick it. The I3 plus 3, if it had also seen a 4th toxicity, would have de-escalated and assigned to 100 milligrams, and possibly would have not allowed itself to re-escalate. But one of the things I've got time to do this, yes. If the other things we might want to do here is say, well, we like the success of picking the MTD, but this possibility is nearly 20% compared to 10% of the rules-based design's probability of being above the target dose. Maybe that's not so acceptable. And can we tune the NCRM to maybe keep the green peaks in the same place, but just shift a little bit of this orange to blue? And the CRM's got it's got more things that we can vary. We could try tweaking the prior. That can be a little bit difficult. It's not immediately obvious to me what we would do here, we want it to be perhaps a little more expecting of toxicity, not at the top dose, because we're already only performing as well as the rule-based, or slightly worse when the true target is the top dose. So we don't want to increase the expectation of toxicity by increasing the mean value for alpha. We might even decrease it. But what we want to do is to change the tweak beta to allow more toxicity at these lower doses. The other thing we can do is to change the overdose rules. So just let it fit the same model, but make it more cautious about escalating or choosing dose with quite so much toxicity. So we can say reduce that to 40%. Perhaps let's clear that one. Let's limit that to just 100 simulations for now. Hopefully that'll be enough to indicate whether we've gone in the right direction and how far we've gone. So that looks pretty promising. Well, half promising and half not. So here in the bottom, the first three scenarios, we've got exactly what we wanted. Nice high peaks on the green still, possibly even higher. Nice reduced overdosing, but then things have gone really rather badly wrong here, where we're now not getting to the dose we want, and we're underpicking and actually underperforming the rules based. So we've got these two choices we could do here. I already flagged that this looked fairly high for the alpha, so we could just try reducing the estimate of alpha sum and the prior somewhat, and maybe allow it to go up. Or we could try modifying this choice and maybe going to say 45 and see how that does. So something I haven't done yet, but what I also should have done is take a look at why it was making some of those decisions. So we ought to we'll see how these results go. But we ought to look at some individual simulations and say, well, why is it not? Why is it over escalating, or why is it not? Or why is it under escalating? So things have improved slightly. These greens are good. This is nice and low. This one's increased. This overdosing has increased a little bit, but we're still underpicking here. So let's have a look at some of these and see if we can see why it's not escalating as far as we want. Let's just space the doses evenly. So there we've gone up to there. We've picked the top dose, so that was successful. So let's find one where it's. So here we go. We've picked a dose that's below. So why did it not escalate? What was preventing it? Was it the estimate of the toxicity, or was it the overdosing rule? So if we look at the cohort responses for this scenario, we can step through the allocation. We can see the fitted curve. And you can see that we've got, 2 out of 12, but we've still got a fitted toxicity of about 17%, which is a little on the high side. So again, maybe this is being pulled up by our prior on alpha. We can also look at the toxicity band probabilities. And we can see that it's always allocating. So what we're seeing here is the posterior probability of being in, 1 out of 12, 2 out of 12, 3 out of 12, 4 out of 12, 5 out of 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 one of the four bands. Blue is underdosing, green is being in the target, yellow is being in the excess, and red is being in the unacceptable. So at this point, clearly, these two are going to combine to give a value well over 40% or in fact over 50%, and it's going to stop us. The overdose rules would stop us at this point allocating the 800 milligram dose. But also, we're not going to want to go there. The target band peak is still at 400 milligrams, and it's the target is still just at 400 milligrams, and even more, it's just at 400 milligrams. So maybe the problem is more the prior than the overdose control rules at this point. Sure, we can find. Oh, I mean to close that. So we can find another. Oh, here's somewhere. It's again. It's peaked an even lower dose. Oh no, sorry, that's the same dose, same one. Here it's picked a low dose, but it's seen quite a bit of toxicity, so maybe that's one where we wouldn't want to try and change what it did. There it's picked the right dose. There it's seen 4 toxicities at 400 milligrams. It's hard to argue that it should be going higher. There it does go higher. So there's one where we might have wanted it to go up. So again, we can look at the cohort responses. And again, we can see we've got really quite a high estimate toxicity relative to the truth and even relative to the observed. So we could just try, at this point, pulling down the prior and alpha. I have no idea what a good value here is here, but let's try 6. Didn't seem to pull it down very much. Let's try 4. No, let's try 0. So it's going to be about a half, isn't it? Let's try that. That's pulled the prior down, and we can just actually probably. Let's just see if that makes any obvious difference. So in terms of selecting the MTD, that's pretty good. But we're back in the tending to overshoot on these 2 scenarios. So maybe we need to go back and tune the overdose control a bit more. I want to show you one last thing, which is something you can do to allow for the CRM, because you don't have a dose escalation table that a team can review. What you can do is allow them to drive a mock trial for them to suggest some simulated results for us to fit them in the facts and tell them what happens next, go back and forth and see if they're happy with the decisions. So we put in, let's say we've done the first 3 cohorts. First cohort 1, 2, 3. The first cohort would have been on 25, second on 50. We'll assume we've seen no toxicities on those. Whoops, it should be 100. And let's say we had no toxicity on the first 2 cohorts, and then 1 out of 3 at the end. And then we can hit run analysis. That shows us the data we've entered and the fitted curve. Over here, it's telling us what it wants to do. tells us you can look at the expected toxicity intervals, and then simply the observed toxicity. Now, this actually took me by surprise because it says escalate again. When I rehearsed this earlier, I didn't get an escalate rule, but that's because I'm using the reduced overdose control. And you can see this. If our overdose control rule was 50%, we're quite likely to be prevented from escalating to the 200 milligram. But what are we? What have we got here? 45%. I don't think that should be allowing. I don't think that should be recommending escalation to 200 milligrams. Oh no, sorry, that's 0.4. I beg your pardon. Yes, that's 0.4. So that is below just below what we've set. So it's allowing us to escalate to the 50 milligrams. Which might be something the team are uncomfortable with. Cohort 4. So maybe we saw see 2 toxicities. And sure enough, it's telling us to step back to the 100 milligram dose. The estimated toxicity at 200 milligrams is around about 50%, so perhaps a little lower than we would like it to be. But the estimate here is 2, a little bit lower third. So maybe our estimate, maybe that prior on the alpha has pulled down our estimates a bit more than we want. That's lower than we might hope it to estimate. And again, we can look at the resulting toxicity intervals from that fit, showing that it clearly prefers the 100 milligrams. So obviously at some point we're going to compare operating characteristics. This is the one before I started varying the CRM design, and you can see apart from the top scenario, it's doing better than the I3+3 and the MTD selection. It's very similar on the expected sample size, but it is seeing a little more toxicity than the I3+3. So it's obviously escalated a little bit more aggressively, and that might be a problem. So as I said, how do we tune it? We can change the overdose rules. We could even add in intermediate dose strengths and then change the escalation rules to be able to step over those as we go up. We could also tune the I3+3. We could say, well, actually, it's a little over conservative. We're actually happy for it to occasionally pick doses with a 40% toxicity. Maybe the plan is to take whatever dose is selected plus the dose below into stage 2. So we could expand the I3+3 toxicity band. We raise the upper bound and hope that it would move some of the times when it's picked an underperforming, an underdose. It would pick the dose in the target band instead. We could also, for any of those designs, we could actually say, well, maybe we're just not allowing them to test enough subjects to find the right dose. Maybe we can experiment with a larger stopping rule. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much. Were there any questions, Nick? It doesn't look like there were. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, and hope to see you next week.